Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this afternoon for a live recording of the Council's Deep Dish podcast. I'm Brian Hansen, Vice President of Studies here at the Council and also host of Deep Dish. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs members for joining us on Zoom today, and want to say how grateful we are for your support to make this possible. Before we begin, a few housekeeping points. Please note the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by those we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Council. Today's on-the-record conversation will be recorded as an episode of the Council's Deep Dish podcast, in addition to this video, which will be available for download on September 3rd. And it can be found on a link posted here in the Zoom chat function. Also, a playback of this discussion on video will be available on the Council's YouTube channel. So for those of you who are tuning in right now, please note that there may be a few momentary pauses as we transition from the video into the Deep Dish portion of the broadcast. To give you a sense, Tomas and I will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, which will be recorded from the podcast. And then afterwards, Tomas will take questions that you can submit. And to do that, open up your browser. It's already open if you're watching us probably, and type in a new window, ccga.live, ccga.live, and you can type your questions into that. I'll be able to see them. You can also vote on questions that others have submitted if you want to make sure that you get yours asked. All right, now let me briefly introduce our speaker for today, who you are probably very familiar with. Thomas Piketty is the Director of Studies at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and is a professor at the Paris School of Economics. He's also co-director of the World Inequality Lab and the World of Inequality Database, and one of the main initiators of the Manifesto for the Democratization of Europe. His research focuses on the interplay of economic development, the distribution of income and wealth, as well as political conflict. As you probably know, he is the author of the best-selling book that may very well be on your shelf, Capital in the 21st Century, published in 2014. And today, we're going to talk about his latest book, which probably should be on your shelf very soon, Capital and Ideology. To purchase a copy of the book, we posted a link to our local partner's website, the bookstore that we work with, the Bookseller, where you can buy a copy today. Thomas, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll transition into our Deep Dish.
Hello.
This is Deep Dish on Global Affairs, going beyond the headlines on critical global issues. I'm Brian Hansen with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And this week we're looking at global inequality and what, if anything, can be done to address it. COVID-19's impact on our health and economies has highlighted and exacerbated the extreme levels of inequality in our societies. Unequal access to healthcare, unequal access to economic opportunities, education, the rights and privileges that protect some and not others based on race. And as has been well documented, extreme inequality is growing throughout the world. Just a brief indication of this in the US, the wealth gap between America's richest and America's poorest families has more than doubled between 1989 and 2016. And the last US Census showed that the median income for Black households was less than 60% of that of white households. So this raises a number of questions. Why do these high levels of inequality exist throughout the world today? And while every society has some level of inequality, are today's levels inevitable? Are they sustainable? Is change possible? And have we reached a tipping point where inequality requires urgent solutions? My guest today is Thomas Piketty, who is an expert and one of the world's foremost economists on these issues. And he has a provocative new book entitled Capital and Ideology. Well, Thomas, really appreciate having you on Deep Dish.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to focus most of our discussion on what your argument tells us about the moment we're living in today and what can be done. And in order to speed this along and get to that part, I'm going to do something completely audacious, which is I am going to summarize your 1,100-page book in about 5 sentences. Obviously, lots of important nuance will be lost. And if I get something wildly wrong, please correct me. But I want to get out that main argument that you've got so that everybody has a common starting point for our conversation today. And as I read you, your main argument is that high levels of inequality are not inevitable and they're not necessary to have a successful economy. Rather, levels of equality are the result of ideas and the policies that are put in place based on those ideas. These ideologies are important because they do a couple things. They justify the inequalities, why the rich deserve to be rich, why the poor deserve to be poor, and what change is possible. Also, you argue that current levels of inequality can be substantially reduced. And to demonstrate this, you take a really magisterial sweep of history and look around the world over hundreds of years to demonstrate that inequality has been lower in the context of economic success at various times. It's been done before, we can do it again. So your point is we can make different choices. And indeed, maybe in one of those moments right now, where we're facing multiple questions and these choices are becoming very, very important. And the key step is for political actors to formulate a new vision of how society should be organized. The world needs ideas and political leadership that will produce greater equity, and you propose a path forward. So did I get it basically right?
It's not bad, it's almost okay. Maybe the only thing, you got it right on the fact that indeed ideas and ideologies are, according to my work, the main driver of inequality. Maybe the only part at the end on which I will formulate it differently is that political actors and leaders are very important, but I think in the end, citizens are more important. Yeah. And what I'm trying to argue in my work is that economics, is not a technical subject, and everybody, should, take it on and have an opinion. And I think a big part of our democratic crisis has to do with the fact that, many people are sort of left economic issues to a small group of experts, who sometimes pretend that they have built a science that is so scientific that nobody else can understand. But of course, this is a big joke. We are in the social sciences. We know very little. We have made progress, in particular, in our understanding of inequality by collecting more historical data. And this is a very collective international research program to which I have been participating and on which my work is based. But we still know very little, and so we have to be modest. And what I'm trying to do in my work is to put this wealth of historical data and diversity of national trajectories on the table, so to speak, so that everybody can take this material, and if you come with different conclusion than the one I get to, I have no problem with this. I have no problem with contradiction, but I think it's important to look at this evidence, because as you said, there's an optimistic message in the book, which is that in the long run, we do see a reduction in inequality. There's been a rise in equality in the long run. Today societies, in spite of the rise in inequality in the recent decades, are still more equal than 1 century ago, and this rise of more equality has been very successful. It has been a condition for increased prosperity. In particular, the prosperity of the US economy in the 20th century did not rely on being more unequal than other countries. It relied on being more educated than other countries. In the middle of the 20th century, when US economic dominance was at its peak, this was because there was a huge educational advance. Like in the 1950s, you had almost 90% of a cohort in the US going to the end of high school. It was not a perfectly equal country. It was very racially divided. But as compared to Europe, where only 20 to 30% of a cohort would go to high school, there was a lot, big educational advance and a relative educational equality, at least as compared to very stratified Western Europe or Japan at the time. And this was the true source of prosperity. So, when I say equality is good and leads to prosperity, it's not that I would like this to be true. It's just that in history, when you try really to compare these different historical periods, different countries, this is what you get. And the rise in inequality that we had since the 1980s, this was supposed to boost growth and boost innovation. Or this is what Reagan told the country in the 1980s. America is going to be great again, is going to grow like you've never seen. Average income, average wages are going to grow like you've never seen. Well, what we've seen is a division of the growth rate by two. National income per capita in the US between 1990 and 2020 has grown at only 1.1% per year. It was 2.2 between 1950 and 1990. It was also 2.1 between 1910 and 1950. And I think what this shows is that having more inequality, more concentration of wealth at the top, more billionaire, in itself is not bringing more prosperity. And I think again, one of the key factors has been, I think, the stagnation of educational investment in the US in recent decades, and the fact that deep-rooted inequality, including the racial inequality, of course, we are talking so much about today, have never, been addressed as much as they should have. So, that's sort of the general message of my book is indeed that we can, renew, continue the long-run evolution toward equality, but this requires paying more attention to, racial division, wealth division, access to property, educational justice. And, I think looking back at history is one of the most powerful way we have to try to find our way and help us for the future.
Which is a perfect setup for where I want to go next, which is to understand what are the key ideas that have led to this high level, this extreme level of inequality throughout the world. You mentioned kind of Ronald Reagan, you think of Margaret Thatcher, you think of maybe François Mitterrand in France, who made the argument about the importance of markets as driving economic success. But what were those ideas on the right? And you also have an interesting set of arguments about how the left abandoned working class interests. So what are these ideas at play today?
Well, I get what I'm trying to show in my book is that there were new challenges which the left in particular was unable or unwilling to take up. These new challenges were had to do with education, with globalization, and with access to wealth. So regarding education, I think in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a relatively simple egalitarian educational platform for the Democratic Party in the US or for the Social Democratic Party or Socialist Party in Europe, which was, okay, we're going to bring 100% of a generation to the end of secondary school. And so there was, sort of big educational push. Now, after this big educational push was achieved, we entered the era of higher education. And then it became sort of more difficult to define what an egalitarian educational target was, because you cannot simply say, okay, we are going to get 100% of a generation at the end of PhD, and which PhD, and so the world of higher education is a world where it's more complicated to define an egalitarian educational objective, because there's indeed a diversity of needs, a diversity of aspiration, and so the left did not really manage to sort of get to a new objective and define a new policy of educational equality, and gradually became somehow the party of the winners of the education game. And this is something very striking that I show in my book, is that in every Western electoral democracy, the left parties used to attract a stronger share of their vote from the lower educated group, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then gradually this has completely reversed, and starting in the 1990s, 2000, 2010, it's actually the higher educated group which vote for the left. I really want to stress, especially with the US audience, that this is something that's not US specific. You get it in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Sweden. You get it, in every electoral democracy, you have the same long run evolution. So the US specific story, like the civil rights movement, which which would have brought the, the white working class to the right, cannot completely do the job of explaining this long-run evolution, because you don't have, the same civil rights movement, in the 60s in Sweden or Germany or France or Britain, and you have the same long-run evolution. So, some people would say, well, the migration cleavage in Europe has sort of played a similar role as the racial cleavage in the US, but which is partly true, except that it comes later. It becomes really a major political issue, not so much in the 60s, but more in the 80s, 90s, or even more recently. And the same long-run evolution starts much before, and it happens at the same speed, even in countries where the political cleavage about migration is much less strong than in others. So I think the deeper explanation has to do with the inability of the left somehow to renew their redistributive platform in front of a new world, the world of higher education, and also in front of new challenges regarding globalization. And I think this has been the other major limitation of the left is, how do you regulate global capital flows and global trade? And is it enough to have, each nation state designing its own tax system, its own social rules, or do you need some sort of post-national and transnational cooperation about the corporate tax and the profits of large multinational and high incomes, high wealth, and as we've not been very good at that. It's only since the 2008 financial crisis that we've started collectively to take a bit more seriously the issue of tax havens, the issue of financial opacity a bit more seriously, but it's only the beginning of this process. And in the meantime, of course, there was also huge geopolitical change that happened, which was the fall of communism, the fall of Soviet Union, around 1990, 30 years ago, which sort of created a sort of big discouragement on the left, generally speaking, on the idea that you can, design another economic system. And this largely contributed to, the fact that we entered this period of limited faith in how much markets can self-regulate themselves, and I think we've gone too far in this direction. I can see why we've entered this era, but when you look, Russia, has moved from being the country of state property to become the kingdom of tax haven and oligarchs, and this has gone very, very far. And as I show in my book, in China today or Russia today, are countries where you have no tax inheritance, for instance. So if you are a billionaire in Asia and want to transmit your wealth with no tax, you should die in communist China. If you go to capitalist Taiwan or capitalist South Korea or capitalist Japan, you will pay an inheritance tax of 40% or 50%, and this was increased. The top rate was increased from 50 to 55% in Japan 3 years ago by a center-right government. And the fact that in a supposedly communist country or post-communist country like Russia or China, it's 0%. I think is a good example of what I mean by the power of ideology. This sort of big, which very far, but they will also go very far in other direction in the future. So this is not the end of the world. These evolutions are going to continue, partly following unexpected shocks, maybe like the one we have today.
So let me offer a couple of alternative explanations for why we have this high level of inequality that doesn't rely on ideas so much, and just see how you react to them. The first set of ideas is basically, these are the economic policies that essentially work. You have to give leadership to the market. You have to reduce the role of government. Tom Friedman, has the argument about a golden straitjacket in a globalized economy. If you don't provide that business environment, people will flee. Certainly in the US, we've heard similar concerns about some of the economic ideas of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. basically, if you go down the road that you're talking about toward greater, to greater equality and addressing these issues, you're going to take us right back to the 1970s and the world of low growth, high unemployment, and that'll be disaster. That's one. The other is, and this comes from us as a global affairs organization, is a different narrative of the Cold War, which was essentially during the Cold War, because of the competition with communists, you needed to build support throughout the United States for the anti-communist agenda, and you also needed to take care of workers because there was a threat. They had a place to go for support. So that what has happened is the end of communism fell, and you no longer need to worry about where workers go politically. So therefore, in the first instance, so therefore it's a power story. Labor just doesn't have the power that it did before, and it's not about ideas. It's just raw political power. And the first one is that's just how economics works. You have to have the inequality. How do you respond to those two counterparts?
Well, the second one about power, is definitely part of what the story I am telling. So I fully agree with you that part of the reason for the mid-20th century reduction in inequality in capitalist country was the pressure from the communist bloc. There's no doubt about it. But I think it's still about ideas. Well, first, the communist bloc itself was a gigantic idea, a gigantic failure, but it was an idea. So, ideologies sometimes can go very far in many different directions, but certainly it was an ideology, a set of ideas on how to replace private capitalism, a major disaster. And next, and most importantly, the reduction in inequality was indeed partly due to this pressure from the rest of the world. It was also due to the pressure from the domestic political forces, the labor union movement, the Social Democratic Party, etc. And it was a big success. That's the point I want to say. So, regarding to your first point, which is, rising inequality is simply what works. This was the discourse of Reagan in the 1980s, which was saying, okay, we're gonna, maybe we're gonna have an increase in inequality, but in the end, this is going to bring so much more innovation to the economy that, there will be a much bigger pie. So, don't worry, because, in the end, your incomes and wages to, my fellow Americans, you will benefit so much from these rising incomes and wages that, who cares about inequality? And indeed, if it had been true, if growth had been multiplied by 2 or, had been increased a lot, who cares about inequality? And I would be very happy to say, well, look, it works so well, that's, the problem is that this is not what happened. So you mentioned the 1970s, but in fact, if you compare, two relatively long period of time, say 1950, 1980, or 1950, 1990, and 1990, 2020. So, I think it's important to compare long period of time, 20 years, 30 years, because if you just pick a few years, you can find a recession in the 70s, but you can also find recession in 2008, you have lots of 2001, you have lots of, the business cycle in every period is playing an important role. So if you want to abstract a little bit from the business cycle, you need to compare growth performance over a longer period. And if you do that, let me remind you again the numbers, which are just the official national accounts of the United States. National income per capita in the US has increased at 1.1% per year between 1990 and 2020. So this is a 30-year period following the Reagan decade with a much higher level of wealth concentration than in the previous period. If you take 1950 to 1980 or 1950 to 1990, it's roughly the same average growth rate, you get 2.2%. Now this 2.2%, which happened with much more progressive tax rate, up to 90%, and on average, the top income tax rate over this period was over 75%, so twice as much as during the following period. Growth rate was twice as large. And this was not due to a post-war reconstruction effect. For Europe, of course, the post-war reconstruction effect is much more important, which makes very complicated this kind of comparison. But for the US, in fact, 1950 to 1990 is not exceptional. It's, in fact, if you take 1910, 1950, you get 2.1% per year for national income per capita. And if you take 1870, 1910, you get almost 2%, 1.9%. So what's exceptional is the really bad performance of the recent decade, 1990, 2020. How can we account for that? There are probably several explanations. It could be that the increasing price of energy, scarcity of energy is starting to play a role, which after all, then it would not be so bad that we have a reduction in growth. I'm not sure this is really a big part of the explanation, but maybe it's a small part of the structural reduction growth rate. There are many other explanations that exist. I think the stagnation in educational investment to me is probably the most important. That's what I point in my book. And I think sometimes people are not aware of that. If you look at total educational investment in the US, or actually in Western Europe, it has stagnated at about 5% to 6% of national income since the 1980s, whereas it had been multiplied by 10 over the course of the 20th century. It was less than 1% before World War I and in the 19th century, even less than 0.5% in Europe, closer to 1% in the US, which had an advance over Europe in educational terms at the time. It has been multiplied by 5 or 6 over the course of the 20th century. Then it has stagnated since the 1980s, which is very paradoxical because, of course, the fraction of a generation going to university has increased a lot. So this means that average investment per student has actually declined. So, in the US, this comes with a lot of inequality, as we know, in the system. So, students going to Harvard or, Chicago University or Stanford, are very well treated, and faculty also are very well treated, and I'm happy for them. But, the bottom 50% or 70% of the US population not only doesn't go to Harvard, but, has suffered from a lack of resources and infrastructure investment over the recent decades. So to me, that's probably, in any endogenous growth model where you try to modelize the evolution of productivity growth with educational investment, depending on how you write your model, it's very easy to generate a decline in the growth rate if you have this stagnation in educational investment. So again, the story that rising inequality is just what works, we need to question that. All the reasoning I've just put forward to you is not supposed to be the final, word on the issue. These are all, we cannot replay history and replay the recent decades with a different policy. So we face a lot of uncertainty, but on the basis of what we have and the historical evidence we have, the case for inequality and at least the case for the kind of inequality we have today with extreme concentration of wealth, the bottom 50% in the US, and it's even more striking if you look at the African American population, but even if you take the entire population, you take the bottom 50%, they own less than 2% of total wealth. And it has actually declined in recent decades. The top 10%, now has almost 70% of total wealth and almost 40% for the top 1%. Is this the best we can do? Is this good for the economy that the bottom half of the children, do not inherit anything, do not have any wealth to create a business, to buy a home, and start from zero, and many of them stay close to zero? Is this really the best we can do, or do we just need to wait for more growth and competition to spread the wealth? But we've been waiting for a very long time, and this very small share to the bottom 50% has not improved over time. So I think if we look at the evidence, I think it's a reasonable conclusion that it's worth thinking of changing the system somewhat.
And let's flip to that discussion of how we change the system, because even in Davos, there's been an admission that inequality is a problem that needs to be addressed. We've got, as I mentioned up at the top, COVID that has really highlighted and exacerbated inequalities. You've got some very specific proposals, a number of which focus on the issue of property. What do you think are the most important, the key elements to a program that can reduce inequality at the same time having continued economic success, or maybe even better economic performance?
Well, I think increasing income and wealth tax at the top in order to invest in education and in universities for the vast majority of the population, is probably the most important policy. Now, in the long run, investing in education is not sufficient, and that's why I also stress the need to think in the long run about the idea of an inheritance for all, the idea that everybody should have access to a minimal level of wealth. So I give an example in my book where I argue, right now the bottom 50% in the US basically inherits zero, between $5,000 and $10,000, but very, very small. I propose that everybody at age 25 receive of the order $120,000 or $150,000, which will be about 60% of average wealth, which will bring everybody to the median. This will not be complete equality. In the system of progressive taxation that I propose, someone who was about to receive 1 million. With the system I propose, will still receive 600,000. So we are still very far from equal opportunity, but I think it will make a huge difference. People who own millions or billions, maybe they feel that 100,000 or zero, it's exactly the same thing. But in fact, when you own zero or when you only have debt, it makes a big difference. If you own 100 or 200,000, because basically, when you own zero, or when you only have debt, you have to accept everything. You have to take any job, any way, any working condition, especially during a pandemic, this can be dangerous. But more generally, you have no choice because, you need to pay your rent. You need to feed your family. You have your negotiation power with respect to your life, with respect to the world in general, is very weak. So it's much more than money. It's about power and about, can you negotiate your own life, and so if you own 100, 200, you can buy a home, or you can start a little business, or you can wait a little bit. You don't need to accept everything. And so I think in the long run, together with more investment in education, it's not supposed to replace a public education system or a minimum wage or a basic income. This is in addition to all of this. I think this will be a way to rebalance the distribution of power in society. And yes, this will also involve, large progressive taxation on billionaires and people at the top, simply because, again, I think, we live in a society, that is a very educated society, and we need everybody to participate. Millions of people have good ideas about how to create businesses and participate to the economy. The idea is that one individual, because he had good ideas at the age of 30, or because he was very lucky at the age of 30, or sometimes both at the same time, should keep controlling 90% stake in a huge company with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees at age 50, at age 70, at age 90. And you cannot, one single individual cannot have the solution on how to organize labor and how to organize work in such large companies. So you have this kind of monarchical ideology applied to economics, which I find completely backward and completely, this is completely out of touch with the reality of the very educated society in which we live, where we need a huge and permanent circulation of power and participation and opportunity. So that's what I describe more fully in my book.
Yeah, and with that also more fully in the book, an emphasis on generational transfer of such huge wealth as well, and creating a more level starting point for everybody. So as we close this discussion, I'm interested, when you look around and see the historic moment we're living in right now, exacerbated by COVID, the resulting financial crisis, with the rise of populist parties, the concerns, heightened concern and mobilization around racial justice issues in this country, and economic and social justice issues in many other parts of the world. Are you hopeful? Do you see signs that not only is Thomas Piketty coming up with solutions like this, coming with ideas, coming up with frames for advancing this kind of a different vision for society, a more equal vision for society? Do you see it happen other places, and what gives you the greatest hope?
Well, I think things are changing much faster than what sometimes people imagine. If I look at the U.S. political debate, on the billionaire tax, for instance, I remember, 6 years ago, in 2014, I had this book, Capital in the 21st Century, where I was advocating for a billionaire wealth tax up to 5% or 10% per year on billionaire. And at the time, I remember I had a public meeting with Elizabeth Warren in Boston, where she was quite skeptical about that and say, well, maybe that. And 6 years later, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were sort of competing about who was going to propose the biggest wealth tax. And I'm certainly not saying this is because of my book. I think there's a much broader evolution, that going on in the world, and an awareness of rising inequality. And when top wealth holders are doing so well, it makes sense to ask them a bit more in terms of taxation rather than a bit less. Again, if you look at the level of billionaire wealth today, you see how much it has increased in the past 10 years, in the past 20 years. If you don't ask a little more revenue there, what are you going to do? Let me stress that, this idea of the billionaire tax has huge majority support in the public opinion in the United States. Every opinion poll I have seen, among the Democratic voters and among the Republican voters, actually support the idea of a billionaire tax. So the problem is not the public opinion. The problem very often is that you have political leaders who are more conservative than the public opinion. Some people say this is because of the way they are funded, and I think it would be naive to say that this has no role at all. Some people say it's the way media is funded and who's paying for the media. I think I want to take ideas seriously. I think it's more than just, okay, you have a few bad people who control everything, and if only we could get rid of them, everything would be great. I think it's much more complicated than that, because designing an equitable society, a sustainable development model, an objective of educational equality with higher education, a post-national, transnational fiscal cooperation, all these are new challenges which require a lot of intellectual work and mobilization and citizen mobilization. How do you reconcile a universal perspective on redistribution, like inheritance for all, with the logic of reparation against past discrimination, and in some case, huge racial prejudices, not only in the US but also in Europe, where people, sometimes imagine that there's no long-run consequence of the long colonial history and the experience of slavery, but of course there are huge consequences for today's structure of inequality in France, in Britain, and so we have to address this at the same time. So these are, I think these are very serious intellectual and political challenges, and I'm trying to contribute a little bit with my work, to raise it. But in the end, this is sort of citizen mobilization on these key issues that will make the difference.
So Thomas Piketty, author of Capital and Ideology, I want to thank you for appearing on Deep Dish to talk about your recent book. So now I want to transition to some of the online questions that we've gotten, and I'm going to ask you as many as I can get in before we have to end in a few minutes. One of them is referring to modern monetary theory, and Professor Stephanie Kelton's argument that for countries like the United States, we basically can spend without having to worry about deficits, to be really crude about it. Does that impact the way you think about these issues?
Okay, so the point that Stephanie and other co-authors and colleagues have made is that, as long as you don't have inflation, then you should spend and you can have more deficit. And I think this point is right. As long as you don't have inflation, you should not do too much about the deficit. And I think this is right. I think this is true in the US. This is true, I think, in Europe today. I think one of the mistakes that was made after the 2008 financial crisis is that we printed a lot of money, but in the end, this mostly was used to save the bankers and the banks to boost the financial markets. And in the end, this benefited mostly, those who had wealth, who had financial portfolio, who had real estate. And I think if today we don't mobilize some of this monetary creation for more sort of socially useful projects, it can be, investment in new technologies. It can be, so Stephanie and her co-authors, advocate very much the idea of a public job guarantee, and but I think if we don't do something like this, then there will be a suspicion by the public opinion that in the end, money creation is only for the bankers, it's only to boost the stock market. So I think that would be a big mistake. Now, that being said, after a certain point, of course, if you print a lot of money and you a lot of deficit and you spend it not to boost the stock market, but to create jobs, to pay people more, to make a real investment in the economy. At some point you're going to have inflation. You're going to have 2%, 3%, 4% inflation per year, and then you have to move to something else. So you have to. This is where you need progressive taxation of income and wealth. This is where you need, all sorts of fiscal and budgetary programs. So monetary policy is not going to be the magic bullet that's going to allow us to stop thinking about progressive taxation. But if you put it at the right place, under the control of a democratic government using other policy tools, then it can be a part of the solution.
So one last question I think we have time for, and the most popular question in the feed refers to the controversy recently, appeared in yesterday's paper, of China's plan to censor part of your book. You talk about, ideas, inequality. Certainly, the Chinese economy has experienced tremendous growth and tremendous inequality. What is the concern that the Chinese have about your book, and what does China tell us about your thesis?
Well, China is certainly telling us about the power of ideology, in the sense that they have built, the people who control China in the Communist Party of China have been telling a story to their people and to the world, saying, well, look, with all the growth we have, all the reduction of poverty we have, we are the right people, we are the right system, we should not try to change the system, and they have some argument, but at the same time, I think that the Chinese system has, of course, many weaknesses, and in particular, there's a lot of inequalities that is very often very opaque. Some people benefited a lot from privatization, people close to the regime, and they can pass on this to their children, sometimes using tax havens or even just doing it in China with no taxation. This is a system that is, of course, very repressive and individual freedom, and it's, and I guess the fact that in this new book I address the issue of the evolution of inequality in China. I talk about the anti-corruption policy of Xi Jinping. I point out the limitation of this policy and the lack of transparency in the regime. So they decided that they didn't want to see that printed in China, so they sent a list of cuts, basically asking every paragraph dealing with contemporary China, and especially those dealing with inequality and opacity in contemporary China, to be suppressed, which I refused. And so, at this stage, it looks as if the book is not going to be published in China, which I find, of course, a bit sad because, I think, my book is very critical on China, but it's also very critical on the US, on Europe, on Brazil, on India, on the Middle East. I try to a critical stand on the different inequality regime and the different ideologies justifying them. And at the same time, I always try to constructive and to see what can be learned from these different experiences, including the Chinese experience, which I stress, was better able to mobilize resources to invest in infrastructure and education than India, for instance. Well, anyway, I'm trying to be constructive, and I'm not being, I don't think I am one-sided, and I'm doing my best. And so it's a bit sad that they decide to refuse the discussion and to, so Xi Jinping was openly, supporting publicly my previous book, which is more centered on Western countries and inequality in the US, etc. And that there are parts on China, they don't want to have it like this. I think if they are afraid of a book like this, what are they going to do with demonstrators in Hong Kong or one day in Beijing or Shanghai? Because it will happen. At some point they will have to face popular demand, and so I find it I find it very, very, very sad, of course, but that's life.
Well, Thomas Piketty, I want to thank you for being here and sharing your ideas. I think one of the things that you have done tremendously well is put inequality and serious discussion about how we think about inequality issues on the table. Whether you agree or disagree with your analysis and proposals, you've done a great service by animating a conversation about these important issues. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.